about the war that's going on in Ukraine and my analysis of it through the lens of my book, The 33 Strategies of War. Now, at the very end, I will give you my emotional appeal because I'm obviously sympathetic to the Ukrainian side, what I think we can all do to support them. But first, I kind of wanted to look at the war through the lens of my book, The 33 Strategies of War, which also is really reflected through the lens of the three, to me, greatest strategists in history, Sun Tzu, Niccolo Machiavelli, and Karl von Clausewitz, who were kind of the guiding spirits of the 33 Strategies of War. So I want to first look at the person who is the complete architect of this war, which is obviously Vladimir Putin. And I want to go inside for a minute into his psychology, into his mindset, because I think in doing that, we can figure out a lot of the puzzles of this war. And the person that Putin reminds me most of in history is obviously Joseph Stalin. And in The Laws of Human Nature, I have a chapter that I go into depth on Stalin called Complete Control, where Stalin's main objective in life, his main goal, his main ambition, was to gain complete control of every aspect of the Soviet Union. And I describe a scene towards the end of his life where he has all of his top people in the Soviet Union. They would come over to his dacha outside Moscow. He'd get them drunk, and then he would put on a record, and he would force them to dance with each other, these men, these middle-aged men. And it was completely humiliating for them, but they were like puppets that he so controlled in their minds, in their actions, that he could literally make them dance with each other. And so I feel that Putin is motivated by the same desire for gaining complete control over everything around him. And so what is the opposite of control? The opposite of control is chaos or unpredictability. And so whenever Putin encounters any slight bit of unpredictability or chaos, he makes these moves to gain control over it so that he never has to experience that again. And so slowly, bit by bit, over the 20 years of his reign, he has created this empire, this world, where one man controls every single aspect of Russian life, a country, the largest country by far on our planet, an immensely complex society. One man governs this completely. And, the way to do that is to work on psychology, to create a myth, an illusion of this power. It's because one person can't control all of that. It depends on creating a lot of these kind of magical illusion-like effects. So let's go into that for a moment. The first layer of his control would be the oligarchs, the men who control the wealth of Russia, largely through oil. And early on in his career, he saw that some of the oligarchs weren't really obeying him. They weren't really on the same page as he was, like Khodorkovsky. So he made his moves to gain control over them. He eliminated any kind of laws that protected their wealth, and he created a situation and their wealth depended completely on him. If for some reason he decided that they were turning against him, he would create laws and he would take their money, their wealth away and give it to somebody else. Then there's also what is known as the Siloviki, which in Russian means the men of force. These are the most powerful men around Putin in government who kind of have his ear. And he's made them complicit in the many crimes he's created. And he's created a situation that if Vladimir Putin falls, they fall with him. Their power, their access to power completely depends on him. So that's one incredibly critical layer of his control. The second layer would be the government itself, this vast bureaucracy. Early on in his career, it seemed that alternative parties, political parties could evolve that could perhaps challenge him. And a few people won governorships in other regions of Russia that were in opposition parties. As somebody that needs control, he could not stand that sense of losing it. So he created new laws, obviously, making these parties basically illegal, basically making it so governors in Russia were something that he appointed, no longer elections. And elections are essentially a farce. And so as it's evolved, the slightest opposition party is eliminated. And so to this day now, there's not even a trace of any kind of opposing political will left in Russia. So now he controls the oligarchs, the men of power, and the government. Then there's the media. Early on in his career, it seemed that there were some voices in television, etc., that were challenging him. So he basically bought all of the television stations. He essentially controls them. And then he spread it to all the various different forms of press. Internet was allowed to kind of go on its own, but now he's completely crushed that. So with now his fingers completely on every level of the media, he controls the narrative of Russia for the Russian people. He's able to play on their greatest insecurities as, Russia's being threatened by the West, etc. He's able to dominate the story that people absorb in Russia. He's able to manufacture whatever truth he wants to spread. A lot of people support him for the reasons I've just mentioned because of this control, and because in some degrees they maybe admire somebody who seems so strong. But then there are little pockets of opposition, little pockets of people who oppose him, like Navalny, etc. And so what somebody who's trying to gain and spread this complete control depends on is the use of fear, intimidation, and even terror. So if you oppose him, the consequences are going to be fierce. With the control that he has created, with these what I call outsized effects, because keep remembering, one man has this insane amount of power. Okay, so a key element is the military. And he has developed this military. He's put all of the money and resources into technology, into weaponry, into missiles, into hypersonic missiles, into tanks, etc. Now, war is an arena that's notoriously fickle. It's called the fog of war. So if Vladimir Putin, like Stalin, cannot stand the slightest shred of chaos or unpredictability, how can you possibly have that in warfare, the most unpredictable of all environments? Well, he has created his own kind of strategy based on what we've talked about: psychology, terror, fear, and intimidation. With all of the money that he has stolen basically from the people and invested in these weaponry, what he does is he bombs the hell out of a place, like he's done in Syria, like he's done in Chechnya. And so within days, he's created this terror, this sense of invincibility, right? He doesn't have to have complex organization of an army. If he literally destroys the infrastructure, if he terrorizes the civilians, if he makes anybody daring to oppose him quake in fear over the consequences, then he wins psychologically first and they surrender. If you bomb the hell out of cities, if you level them, then you control the dynamic completely. And he's used this brilliantly prior to these wars on the world stage. In 33 Strategies of War, law number 15 is called Control the Dynamic, forcing strategies. And what it is it's the ultimate of an offensive warfare. So on the world stage, he has used the same thing that he has applied to the country of Russia, where he makes everybody react to him, where he completely controls the dynamic. So he meddling in our elections, fiddling with Europe and European politics, invading Crimea, etc., continually putting other people on their heels and making them react to him, which is a form of control, just like Stalin controlled the men around him and making them dance to his tune. He's making everybody in the world react and dance to what he creates. Okay, so war is hard to manage that, but he's created this method of warfare that allows him to have this complete control. But what it depends on, as it depends on Ukraine, is very quickly creating the sense of terror and intimidation and surrender through the bombing campaign, and then using local quislings. The word quisling means people in a country who basically are going to support another country and betray their own nation out of money or etc. And they've kind of become puppets of the invading army. Those are quislings. He's very effective in using them in Syria, in Chechnya, in Georgia, etc. Okay, so it depends on this strategy of a very quick lightning strike with his missiles, his weaponry, his air force, creating terror, creating surrender, and using his puppets from within to gain control politically of a situation. Okay, so now we entered the Ukraine war, and let's look at it now through this lens of Putin and his mindset of control. Think of this control as a kind of bubble that envelops him, where he controls everything around him. There's no holes in that bubble, right? There's nothing that can possibly threaten him. Okay, so when it comes to the Ukraine war, because all of the people around him, the military leaders, live in terror of him, of fear of him, of displeasing him, because they've bought the myth of this incredibly powerful person's one man, right? So when it comes to the planning stage of the war, the invasion of Ukraine, they're deathly afraid of telling him the truth. He has this belief that what worked in Syria worked in Chechnya. Yeah, it might be a little more complicated in Ukraine, but it will definitely have the same effect. Ukraine will fold and collapse. Zelensky will flee. He'll put in his puppet. The West will get a little bit upset, America and Europe, but they depend on his oil. They'll collapse as well. The generals, many of which have revealed this later on, know that that is not the truth. They know that the Ukrainian people are not going to collapse like that they don't want the Russians to liberate them and become part of the Russian totalitarian system. But they're deathly afraid of telling him. And so he creates a plan of war that already has a flaw in it because it's not based on reality. So if we think of that bubble, this is one little prick in that bubble, one little element of chaos that can now enter because he has a false perception of the goals and the power and the effectiveness of his invasion. Okay, and the second little prick in that bubble comes in the following. In order to win in this kind of warfare, with this lightning strike, you have very little logistics. You're very light on logistics. And logistics means the support teams that every army needs, the teams of medical teams that will help the wounded soldiers, the food supplies, the spare parts for the tanks, the ammunition, etc. That's very costly and can weigh and slow down an army. But when you have this lightning quick strike, you don't need to put a lot of money and time into logistics, all right? So this lightning quick strike, the bombing, the controlling the airspace, etc., it doesn't work. Ukraine doesn't collapse. Kiev doesn't fall within a couple days. And Ukraine is an enormous country. It's the size of France, basically. It would be the largest country on the European continent besides Russia. So you have this army that's invaded, and the lines are immense, right, of the tanks, the military, etc., stretched out for miles upon miles. And they have very, very little logistics, very little logistical support. So things are breaking down. Tanks are falling apart. There's no spare parts for them. Food supplies, even food supplies are dwindling. Oil and fuel for all of the vehicles, they're in short supply. And so more and more little bits of chaos are entering into the system, into the perfect ideal of war that he's trying to create. He's losing control, is slipping away from him. The other element is, because he wants this complete control, the Russian military is structured in the most top-down hierarchical manner, right? So normally it's an axiom of military, of warfare, that you want unity of command, that you want essentially one general on top who oversees the whole thing. But oddly enough, there doesn't seem to be somebody like that in Russia. It seems to be actually all funneling up to perhaps the defense minister or perhaps to Putin himself. We don't know. So what happens is orders come from on top down to the soldiers on the field. Tanks move here to point A, right? They're never told why they're moving there. Just this is where you go, this is what you do. And as they react to what's actually happening on the field, there's no way to communicate that to those on the top because the system doesn't allow it. Everything must come from the top down. Those on the field don't have any influence over the overall strategy of the brilliant person in charge of all this. So essentially what that means is the army, the soldiers on the field, have no way of adapting to the changing circumstances in warfare. And as we said, war is an incredibly unpredictable environment, what Clausewitz calls friction. And the Russian army can't adapt to all of this friction, which is creating more and more of that chaos that we've been talking about. Another element is the Russian soldiers themselves, right? In the end, the war depends on their ability to fight on the field or in the airspace, okay? The soldiers know that because there's no logistical support for them, or very little support for them, those in top don't really care about them. They're fodder thrown into this army. In fact, most of the soldiers in the Russian army are these 19 and 20-year-old conscripts from villages outside of the major cities in Russia. They're not even told that they're going to invade Ukraine until the last minute. And once they're there, they're not even told why they're there, or they're given this idea that the Ukrainians will greet them as liberators. And so as they experience the actual terrors of the war, as opposed to Putin sitting up in his little bubble in the Kremlin, they are seeing that things aren't going well. They are actually terrorists. They're demoralized by what's happening, right? And so the morale is slipping and slipping, and the performance of the army is slipping. Yet another little prick into that bubble that Putin has tried to create. And so we can see many examples of this inability for the Russian army to adapt and the devastating effect it is having on morale. So look, for instance, at tanks. Putin has invested a lot of money into tanks, and they're kind of a symbol of who he is in a way, because the tank is this incredibly intimidating weapon, right? It looks so large and impressive. Who can resist a tank? And it looks great on the military squares when it's Victory Parade Day in Moscow, all these hundreds of tanks rolling down the streets near Red Square, etc. It looks great, and it has a psychological effect. But modern warfare, at least in the last 10 years, has revealed that tanks are essentially useless because these very, very powerful anti-tank weaponry has evolved that can completely destroy a tank with one well-aimed missile. There are even drones that can do that. And so tanks are actually a great show, but they're very ineffective. And the Ukrainian army has been brilliant at ambushing these tanks and hitting them with these missiles. And so the soldiers now who are having to deal with this, what do? They're sitting ducks out there in these long lines while the Ukrainians are picking them off one by one with their mobile forces. Okay, we're going to go hide our tanks in forests and woods so they can't sneak up on us and ambush us. And I saw one video that was really chilling and very interesting, in which the Ukrainian army has these drones that have thermal imagery on them, right? They're able to detect heat. And so the Russian soldiers are sitting in their tanks in these forests trying to hide because they're terrorized with any moment being exploded in this machine, this claustrophobic machine that you can't escape. Imagine for yourself the terror that would inflict, knowing that any moment that could happen, right? Okay, so it's freezing cold in Ukraine in the winter, so they have their engines on to kind of heat themselves in these woods that they're hiding in to kind of keep themselves warm during this frigid winter. And these drones are hovering over above the woods, invisible to them, able to detect the heat that's coming out. And to the Ukrainian soldiers, these little bits of heat appear as white dots on the screen that they're using. And they're shooting at these white dots one by one, picking off these tanks they're supposedly hiding in the woods, creating even more terror. How do you adapt to that? How do you possibly react when nobody in your military has ever had to deal with it, has ever had to plan for this? Another element of incredible incompetence and inability to adapt is in the Russian system of communications. Now, keep in mind that Putin fetishizes technology and high-powered weaponry and the latest gadget that he can invest his money in. So they invested millions of dollars in this new era encrypted communication system. But when the Russian army invaded Ukraine, they knocked out all of the 3G towers so that the Ukrainian military couldn't communicate. But the new era encrypted communication system depends on 3G towers. So they're completely useless. They're completely ineffective. So what you have is Russian commanders using their cell phones to communicate to their armies that they command, now flung out on these incredibly long lines on cell phones, which the Ukrainians are able to listen in on and then kind of figure out exactly, because they speak Russian, what exactly is going on, giving them yet another advantage. So you add up all of these layers here, and you see more and more little bits of chaos entering the system, the fog of war, the unpredictability of war, creating a kind of a mess. All right, so it's an axiom in warfare that an army reflects the citizenry, the politics of the nation that it's supposed to represent, right? A democratic army has a particular feel. An authoritarian army has a much different feel. And so the government of Russia is based on one man in control of this vast, vast bureaucracy. It is extremely hierarchical, top down. It doesn't value the creativity of those in government, those serving him. Everything is supposed to come from the top, right? There's zero amount of engagement of the citizenry, of the people in the actual governance of the country. And that's how the military is structured. It's extremely rigid, just like the Russian government is extremely rigid and ossified, okay? And in military history, the army that to me most resembles that is the great Prussian armies of the 18th century, led by Frederick the Great, who created what was at the time the most devastating military power on the European continent. And the source of Frederick the Great's power of the Prussian army was the incredible discipline that he invested in them. And so the Prussian soldier was like a robot, an automaton. They were so disciplined that they knew exactly how to behave. They were brilliant at marching, and they would intimidate opponents by the sheer force and psychology that they would instill fear in these disciplined Prussian forces that were fearless, marching on an enemy. And for decades, they were the preeminent military power on the continent of Europe, which is to me similar, very rigid army, similar to Putin's army, where control is everything. And that was sort of Frederick the Great's mantra. But then what happens in the 1790s, a young man enters the scene named Napoleon Bonaparte, a product of the French Revolution. And Napoleon Bonaparte is going to effect the greatest revolution in military history ever, right? So he's not weighed down by all these principles of warfare that govern Frederick the Great's army. He's completely free and loose and very young. And so he creates, first of all, a new form of army, a people's army, filled with hundreds of thousands, millions of French citizens who believe they are fighting to spread the message of the French Revolution on the continent. Now, a lot of that is an illusion, created by Napoleon, but it basically created an incredibly motivated army. The second thing was Napoleon realized, and I remember we're saying that warfare is an arena of chaos, friction, and fog. Napoleon realized that instead of reacting against that friction, like Frederick the Great had, I'm going to use it. I'm going to use chaos to my advantage. I am going to deliberately create chaos on the battlefield. But the chaos is going to be hitting more the enemy than me because I'm prepared for it. And I'm going to react to the chaos faster than the enemy. And whoever can react faster has the control. So I'm going to deliberately make more chaos on the battlefield. How did he do that? He loosened up the structure of the army. He created divisions that he would fling. The Prussians would advance in this one line, and Napoleon would throw 4 or 5 armies from all different directions, divisions, coming in these free-flowing manners. The enemy would go, what the hell? I don't know who's attacking from what side, behind or whatever, and they would collapse. He would make these very rigid Prussian generals react to this increasing chaos. And the key element of that was he would give his lieutenants on the field incredible leverage, incredible leeway. They could do what they want. They didn't have to wait for Napoleon's orders. They could see what was happening on the battlefield. They could adapt to it, they could change, and they could create even more disturbance and more problems for the enemy in that way. So he let them kind of act on their own. Also, he had created these brilliant channels of communication. So the soldiers in the field would be able to communicate to Napoleon himself, the man in control of it all, the equivalent of a Putin, what exactly was happening on the field in real time, before the era of telephones, before the era of telegraphs or anything. You know, they would march on their horses. They would say, Napoleon, this is what's happening on the field. This is what the soldiers experience. Okay, let's change our strategy. So he had communication. He had a free-flowing method, and he dominated, absolutely for 10 years, dominated European warfare in a way that has never been repeated since. And then slowly, he fell for the idea of trying to control things and trying to overwhelm the enemy with firepower instead of mobility. And he himself fell apart, and he had 10 years of decay. But those 10 years of brilliance have completely revolutionized modern warfare to the idea of creating maneuver warfare and the value of mobility and communication. And a man came along named Karl von Clausewitz, who was a Prussian officer, who realized the brilliance of the essence of Napoleonic warfare. And he adapted it for the Prussian army itself, the most rigid army that ever existed, right? He adapted the Napoleonic system. He created what's known as the Auftragstaktik, the mission statement, where you give your army an idea of the mission they're to accomplish, and you let them do it on their own and adapt to what's going on the field, okay? So now let's look for a second at the Ukrainian army, because I said an army is a reflection of the country and the politics from which it comes. It's not just this sort of branch of power that exists on its own. It's a reflection of the form of government that it serves. Okay, so the Ukrainians had a series of revolutions, starting in 2004, then starting with the Orange Revolution and the Maidan Revolution. They were trying to split off from Russia and create something different. But there were still very many remnants of the Russian system in Ukraine after the split up of the Soviet Union. There was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of power being held by oligarchs, etc. And then Zelensky comes into power several years ago. And he came into power with the promise of reforming Ukraine and making it more democratic, making it more like a European country. And one of the most important things he did was to extend the reforms to the military. He and the defense minister that he hired, whose name I'm going to butcher, but it's basically Zagorodnyuk, who's sort of the equivalent of the Ukrainian von Clausewitz, decided